Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Health Evolution Collective. Today, I have the honour of introducing you to Peter Ballerstedt, who I have followed for quite some time and just find the work that you do, Peter, fascinating. And I'm very, very excited that I am sharing this with my audience today.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the support. I'm looking forward to this as well.
Thank you so much. So I was listening to someone you actually, on your own podcast yesterday, and you asked your guests to introduce themselves by saying, "You're at a party, we meet for the first time. Tell us a little bit about you. How would you introduce yourself to someone?"
Hi, my name's Peter. And I work in agriculture. I work in forage agriculture, specifically for a forage seed company. I have a keen interest in ruminant animal agriculture, and I serve that industry in a number of ways. Been married to Nancy since 1977. We live in Western Oregon. We've got 2 dogs. And what's your name?
Hi. That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, Peter, it's lovely to meet you. And I'd just love to know, I love to get people's evolution, I guess, being the podcast that I talk about. So firstly, what got you interested in ruminant agriculture in the first place?
Good question. I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That area that I grew up in had been farming area a generation or so before I was born. So we were watching the housing developments, the conversion process. I was lucky enough to get out into the country at one point and discover that I really liked it much better out there than in the suburbs. But it took a couple other coincidences for me to get introduced to agriculture. Ironically, I was hoping to enroll in a construction technologies program, but they were all full. So they said, take some, of your electives or required courses, come back next term, we'll have a slot for you. And one of the electives I took was a field crops production class. And that got me onto a dairy farm where the exercise was to make a farm plan. How many acres, what kinds of soils, what could you grow where, how much feed did you need to produce, so how much corn, how much alfalfa. It was upstate New York, so that was the primary crop rotation there. And again, for a dairy. That just got me interested. That led me to focus on agriculture for the next several years in university. At one point, I came under the influence of a gentleman who was a forage and pasture ecologist. And that changed the trajectory once again. And I ended up working on ingestive behavior of grazing animals at the University of Kentucky, graduated, joined the faculty at Oregon State as a forage specialist. So if you're going to work in forages, you best know something about ruminant animals. That's why we grow forages primarily, is to feed sheep, goats, cattle, deer, buffalo. And that's how I got interested in that bit. I graduated university in '86 and served on the faculty at the local university until '92. Took a bit of a break, worked in high tech, and then came back to agriculture in 2011.
Okay. And then, so from that time, or was it before that time, did you start to get interested in the nutrition side of it as well? Because I've heard there's a bit of a health story, that you've sort of gone through as well. And then, marrying that with what you've learnt about, ruminant agriculture. How did that all sort of play out for you then?
It was during my extended sabbatic from agriculture that I came to realize in 2007 that I was a 51-year-old balding, obese pre-diabetic. And fortunately, Nancy had for the 5 years prior been reading and learning about low carbohydrate diets. Um, and her approach was, this is what I'd like to eat. What would you like to eat? And I tried various things. Finally, 2007, I became convinced of this approach for myself as well. And at that point, it was Michael and Mary Dan Eads' Protein Power Life Plan. Gary Taubes's book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, was just about to come out. It came out later that year. And so those books then gave me enough information to make significant progress in reversing those conditions. By 2010, I got to attend a conference where all these people were, Seattle's 5 hours away from here. So yes, I was going to show up, and that made me aware that I know things based on my professional training that many people in the human nutrition and metabolic health space don't know. And that those people in the human nutrition and metabolic health space know information that my friends in agriculture I felt really needed to hear. The health statistics are not that different between the general population and the farming population. And so that launched me into this role of trying to bridge the gaps between producers and consumers and different disciplines, and trying to get more people aware of the story of animal source foods' role in the human diet, especially the value of ruminant animal agriculture in producing some of those foods, and what I consider to be the unsustainable crisis that we're facing, which is metabolic illness. So it was born out of my personal experience. It was married to what I already knew and what I learned along the way. And as I've gone, I maybe have gotten a little bit more nuanced in how I communicate it. I try to not be, I don't want to talk about us and them anymore. I don't want to engage in diet wars. I want to communicate the information that I know is available, but I believe is not widely enough yet known.
I think that's why, I've certainly been drawn to you. I do appreciate that. And I know a lot of people do appreciate that, because we can get very caught up in dogma and very much in black and white thinking. And I think some of what, certainly a lot of what I've learned by listening to your YouTube videos and listening to your podcast is that it's really not that simple. It's not black and white. And, when you start to dig a little bit, underneath the surface, you can see really it's actually a lot more nuanced than that. So I'd love to just get, what are those things? What are some of the biggest things that you would love, both I know you talk about bridging that gap between both sides, not that that's sides, you know what I'm saying, but, what would be some of the biggest things, that you would like people to know around that? Not, maybe the biggest misinformations that are being perpetuated currently around, the myths, whether it's plant versus animal based, whether it's, do ruminants cause environmental damage, are they ruining the planet?
All of those would be things that I'd like people to understand. One of the things, my phrases is, when you improve your health, you are improving the world. And we've got some very bizarre conversations taking place publicly now. And I can take them down to the level that says basically, yes, we know we have all this evidence that if you eat this way, you're going to lower your risk of all these chronic diseases because you're you're correcting metabolic syndrome, which we could talk about. But basically, yes, we know you're getting healthier, but and it's like, wait a minute, no, stop. You're getting healthier, period. Full stop. And that then leads to all kinds of benefits in your life, in your family's life, in the life of your communities. And I want to extend that even further. So that's number one, that I don't think people put a sufficient value on individual health in many of these conversations. Number two would be there are no sustainable food systems without livestock agriculture in general and without ruminant animal agriculture in particular. So there's no separation. And again, there's no either or. And we could talk later, but I think there's some really good news about how when those things are combined, we can see what we have to achieve going forward to meet the needs of mid-century humanity. And we could talk about those specifics. Basically, it's very good news. For those of us in high-income countries like yours and like mine, most of us have access to the food that we need at some level, varies by individual, varies by preference, but animal source food is essential for the proper development and function of all human beings at some point in their lives. So if we talk about pregnant women, we talk about nursing mothers, we talk about the infants or the children that they're nourishing, or we talk about seniors. Those are the ends, those are the periods where I believe the evidence has shown we need animal source food in order for us to develop properly, age properly, function properly. In between, maybe we've got some more leeway. So that's another key point for people to understand. I'd also like people to rethink some of the terms that we use in our conversations. So I think that we have three dietary approaches. We've got, and you could look at them from whatever perspective you want to. We've got vegan, that is no animal source food, exclusively plant source food. We've got carnivore, which is exclusively animal source food, no plant source food. In between, we've got omnivore. I'm trying to get us to stop saying vegetarian because vegetarians eat animal source foods. Maybe they don't eat meat. Okay, fine. You're still eating animal source foods. And there's more animal source foods than meat. And so it's important for us to have those kinds of conversations. I'm also convinced that the information that we need to make the kinds of choices that people think they're making doesn't exist. I think that if people think that we know that eating a certain way will eliminate our risk of chronic disease 10, 20, 30 years down the road, I'm sorry, you've believed a fiction. We're nowhere near knowing that. If you think that you know enough about protein to make sure you're getting adequate protein in your diet, you probably don't. If you think that you can read labels and gain meaningful information about how to achieve, or if you track your macros, that's going to give you useful information, I'm pretty sure you can't, you aren't, and you don't. And those are deeper. Yeah, sure.
Ask about that because that's I find that fascinating and I'd love to know why that's the case. Why is something like that we actually, many in the nutrition world, and speak to any nutritionist, or, they will say black and white, well, we do know that, but why don't we know that?
Well, let's start with protein. Certainly
Yeah.
in the United States, when you see on a label or in a table of nutritional composition, right, it says protein for whatever item you're talking about. that value is actually technically crude protein. So it's a value that we estimate by determining the total nitrogen composition in a food sample. Percent nitrogen, we multiply that number by 6.25. The result of that, the product of that, is crude protein, because we assume that all the nitrogen that was in that sample was in protein, and we assume that all that protein was 16% nitrogen. Okay. Now, we've done this for well over 100 years. We've got lots of data. It's relatively inexpensive. It works okay with ruminants for a reason that we could talk about. But for monogastrics in the United States, we haven't used that figure in swine nutrition for 4 decades now. Because in swine nutrition, they knew and they know and they practice balancing rations on a digestible, indispensable amino acid basis. Now, this has been recommended for human nutrition as well. I think that recommendation was 7 years ago was made, 7.0, sorry. But it's expensive. It's hard to get that kind of information. We don't have it quite yet. I think there's also some political reasons for foot dragging. The industry maybe isn't really happy about doing that. There are certain interest groups that maybe aren't very happy about doing that. But you begin to see now, if you think you're getting so many grams of protein off of a label, well, if it's coming from plants, a significant amount of that isn't coming from protein or amino acids at all. And we absorb amino acids. So within that thing called crude protein, which we just shortened to protein, you can have something called non-protein nitrogen. So a certain amount of the nitrogen that we multiplied by 6.25 to estimate protein wasn't coming from protein. And so that's a problem. And if you have plants that have nitrate, for example, that nitrate now gets estimated to be part of the protein. In potatoes, for example, it can be as much as a quarter of the protein that's listed is actually coming from non-protein nitrogen. And then on top of that, we've got other factors like just because it's present doesn't mean it's digestible. And so that's why we have this recommendation to go to a more sophisticated estimate, but we haven't gotten there yet.
That's fascinating. And would there be an element too of, how it reacts in individuals would vary as well?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean,
Yeah.
we're this wonderful constellation of variation. And again, as we get older, we get less effective at, or efficient, or whatever the right word is, and we need more than the currently established guideline for adults in terms of protein content and high quality. It's always assumed to be high quality. That's something else. A reference protein is another thing that you'll hear, but what that means is basically animal source food. That's what that means. But again, a lot of this nuance gets lost in the translation by the time it gets to the public policy recommendation.
So for a consumer sitting there trying to make the good, best, optimal choices for ourselves and our family, what would that look like in your opinion then, if we take away the fact that what you've just talked about in terms of how nuanced it all is, and how we probably really, the label isn't really going to be the best guide? What would be the best guide then?
Yeah, I guess what I would suggest is for people, and again, this is individual preference driven. So if somebody doesn't want to eat red meat, but they're okay eating poultry and shellfish and fish and dairy and eggs, fine. Whatever fits for you. There are good guidelines available in terms of what that ought to look like for individuals at different stages of growth. And I'm not a human nutritionist. What I do is I focus on consuming the animal source food, and I eat when I'm hungry, and I generally don't eat when I'm not. And I try to avoid the processed plant products. That's something else. The processing of plant products by itself influences their nutrient value. So specifically for protein, it lowers its digestibility of certain key indispensable amino acids. So in any case, I've learned through the time that I've been following this kind of a lifestyle that my level of carbohydrate needs to be very low, much lower than my wife's or her mother's or her father. He's, I describe him, he's 87 now, I believe, and he's always been, or 88, he's always been a skinny little Italian kid, right? I mean, that's his stature, and he wants a roll with every meal. Great, perfect. You're going to have it, no problem. When you eat here, absolutely. But I've learned that I can't eat that and be at the weight I'd like to be and with the metabolic markers that I think indicate that I'm at the best health I can enjoy. So if somebody's going to the market, I don't know if it holds in Australia, but they talk about shopping the outside of the supermarket,
Mm.
not the
Yeah,
inside aisles,
same.
because the
Yeah.
outside you'll find the fresh veggies and the fresh meats and dairy and such. And inside you'll find the wheat. Was it Wheat Bix? Is that the
Mhm.
okay?
Weet-Bix, yes.
And other cultural delights. So if eggs are a remarkable source of nutrition, and in this country at least, they're remarkably affordable.
Mm.
Um, and even this was some research that I came across, and I interviewed a meat scientist. And when we look at the processed meats, lunch meats, bologna, salami, jerky, bacon, cured meats, those sorts of things, we actually see that the digestibility of their indispensable amino acids, this DIAAS, DIAAS score, actually increases. We make them more valuable. And so people buying hot dogs may actually be getting, so long as, they're all meat hot dogs, you may be getting an incredible source of the high quality protein that we must have for a good price. And so part of my message is, buy what you can afford. Don't take on additional stress. Don't worry about some of the label claims. Know what you're after and get what's available, appropriate, and affordable to you.
Mm. Yeah, wow, interesting, and I think too with hot dogs, they generally put in the stuff that I don't know if this is true or not, but the stuff that we don't, generally like to eat anymore, but it's actually really nutrient dense, part of the
Well,
animal.
yeah, I mean, it depends on the brand and all
Mm,
those things. But yeah, you
mm,
could certainly go to delicatessens and find liverwurst and find head cheese and these other products that by tradition, that's one of the ways that we got the most usable products from each animal, which is
mm.
key to sustainability.
Yeah, it is, and but even, with the knowledge I've got, I think, it does. It's very difficult. I love what you're saying. But the messages are just so different. I certainly hear. Just I was shopping yesterday, and there's this massive advertising thing outside one of our big supermarket chains. Make healthier choices. Buy plants, buy more plants. It just seems to be that's the message that is out there, and it's clearly not what you're saying. So where I don't know where has it all gone wrong, or
Mm.
what's going on there?
Well, I guess so. First of all, let's say if somebody's, they're eating biscuits and wheat bix and goodness knows what else as their diet, buying more plants probably is better, right? I mean, if you, so it depends on where you're starting. That's part
Mhm.
of the conversation. Um, but it, there have been a number of authors that whose books I freely recommend. Gary Taubes, Nina Teicholz would be two off the top of my head, but I mentioned Michael and Mary Dan Eads earlier that tell the story of how we got to where we are. And it's a big story and there's lots of moving parts. But one of the things that has to be acknowledged now, and the way I put it is, we have objective, high quality scientific evidence of the harm that comes to human beings when they don't eat enough animal source foods. And this is globally, I'm speaking, but also in high income countries. There are tragedies that we hear of here. Um, there is a story that says there's harm that comes from eating too much animal source food. And I have yet to find evidence of equal quality. I know where that evidence is coming from. I know the methodology that produces it. And it's the same methodology that got us on the track that we're on, this nutritional epidemiology of chronic disease. The myth that we can accurately estimate what free living human beings eat on a daily basis over a long period of time, and then see what diseases they come down with 20, 30, 40, 50 years later and make any meaningful connections between the two. I think this is the right quote, but it goes something like this: 80% of the claims made based on those kinds of studies fail when they're tested in clinical trial. 80, 80. Now, if you flipped a coin, if it was a fair coin, you'd expect to be closer to 50-50, right? So if you're that wrong, it it suggests to anyone from a statistical background that there's a bias involved.
Mm.
Okay, so that's part of it. And then you could, talk to people like Belinda Fetke, and she could talk about some of the specific interests that have been involved in shaping this conversation. You could look at the story that Nina Teicholz tells, which is, for example, how olive oil became sanctified as this healthy, dietary item. Well, it just so happens that a lot of that was funded by the olive oil industry. Well,
Mm.
okay, great, wonderful. I'm all, just so long as everybody knows this.
Mm.
And you could find the same thing again and again and again. There are these industries that benefit. There are interest groups that have their perspective, and those could be communities of faith of a specific nature. They could also be the genealogy of researchers and their graduate students, right?
Mm.
And specific schools that are involved that come up with these theories, and even though they fail repeated tests, they're still perceived to be unbiased, worthwhile, creditable sources. And the more you dig into this, and the more that you understand how poorly we've been served, we, all of us, have been served by these policies, because these policies impact so many different things. People will frequently in the US say, what is the dietary guidelines? Nobody follows that. Well, that's a myth. Part of that myth is it excuses what's actually happening to the public health, right? It's not that the policies are bad or the guidelines bad. It's the people aren't following it. Well, no, actually, we have evidence that they are. Um, but it's more than that, because in the United States, millions of people are fed every single day by the government, schools, institutions of various kinds, assistance to people, economic challenge. And those guidelines influence what they can purchase or what's purchased for them and fed to them. I mean, they may have very little choice about what they eat. So these things are very, very important. They guide and influence research. So on a number of levels, once you begin to see the interconnection, it becomes obvious. But again, I got this from a friend, science is not equal to policy, or policy is not equal to science, depending on how you want to look at it. And so this wasn't settled through a scientific debate and means. It was a political solution and a political policy that was then implemented. And I'm afraid it spread from there to your country and to others. And although I've been told Sweden was the first country to have dietary guidelines, I can't verify that.
Those Swedes. Yeah, and that was definitely something I learned from Nina too. I have to admit, I used to do, well, when I first sort of came across low carb and started understanding all that, and I was like, well, people have their choices, they've just got to do it. I don't need to follow the dietary guidelines, I can do what I like. But then of course it's what people are fed in hospitals. It's what my child was fed at daycare. And then just yesterday, my youngest started school and of course came home with this big brochure on what to put in your children's lunchbox. Mostly grains, vegetables, no problem with vegetables.
Mm-hmm.
And then a tiny bit down the bottom, meat or meat alternatives. Mm-hmm. And they didn't have a picture of any meat. It was egg as their meat or meat alternative. So, that's the problem. And then my kids go to school. I've got high school age children as well. And they get told something completely different to what I've taught them at home. And then, of course, they've been ridiculed and gotten into trouble for suggesting that actually eating animal fat is good for your body and your brain. And, that's where I think it filters down. And, from a perspective of a mum who are under a lot of pressure to feed and to be and to do and to try and make the right decisions when you're in the supermarket, that ad that we've just seen about eating plant-based for your health as well as for the environment. Well, unless we take the time to delve deeper and beyond that, we are just going to grab that product and think that we're doing the best for ourselves and our kids. So, I'm very grateful for people like you that, just help show people that we do have to, unfortunately, look beyond what we're told. And, one thing I listened to what you were saying on a podcast yesterday is that these people who, whether it's religious ideology, I've spoken a lot to Belinda. If you're listening to my podcast, please look, I did a 3-part series chat with Belinda where she goes through all of that religious ideology. These people really actually believe what they're saying, and whether the science backs it up or not is irrelevant, really, because it's such a deep belief. And I think when we're dealing with that, it's a lot harder because they really don't want to give that up.
So, well, first of all, I follow a plant-based diet because ruminant animals are plant-based. I refer to beef and lamb and venison as fermented plant products. And if you understand the principles of ruminant digestion, then you get the joke. But that's true. The vast majority of what ruminant animals eat is plant matter that we can't utilize directly. So they actually increase and improve the food supply for humanity, as well as doing many other things. But let's get it back to our individual experience, right? We know from the people working in the realm of insulin resistance. So Professor Bickman, others point to this amazing constellation of chronic illnesses, which all have some relationship to insulin resistance and chronically elevated insulin. So I look in the mirror. Do I see that? If this has been a subject, that I've been speaking with my doctor about, okay, here's a lifestyle, and I've tried. I mean, maybe if I'm looking for an alternative because what I've tried hasn't worked, right? Is I think Gary Taubes said it, that nobody wakes up and just realizes for the first time that they're 100 pounds overweight. I mean, this is a process that we're well aware of as we go along.
Mm.
And the shame and the scandal, by my estimation, is that we can have people who are going through that kind of an abusive situation for so long before they hear about this alternative, which actually is the older one. It was actually established in the science before this newer idea that if you just eat less or exercise more, you'd be skinny like me.
So we're not
And
the fad, just to put that out there.
yeah.
Mm.
So if part of what's happening today is individuals are finding somehow this information, as they have for the last couple of decades. I mean, I think Gary Taubes makes that point in the case for keto, that the reason that these diets keep coming back around is because they work and others don't. And so it's a fad because the people promoting the alternative diets call it a fad. It's not a fad when it comes to results on an objective basis. And we now have a lot of scientific evidence to back it up. So on the individual level, I invite people to try it. Part of the message is eating more animal source food is not going to give you a heart attack, right? Now, depending on your health status, you may have a heart attack, but it won't be because you've been eating the animal source food. It may well be, and is likely to be, a situation that was already in process prior to you making this change. So there's an important distinction there. And that's why we should always, be in touch with our healthcare professionals to make sure where we actually are. But even there are metrics that are better than the ones we've been, interested in. Total weight is not a good metric of health. BMI is not a good metric of health. Total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol are not good metrics of health. There are better ones, and we need to learn more about those if we're going to be truly informed consumers. Okay, once we've learned that, then we learn where we are. If we want to change that, then we have something we can monitor, and we can see how we individually respond to whatever we're doing. It gets tricky because nobody goes on a diet, for example, and few people make a change and only change one thing. They tend to do a bunch of things. And so at the end, you can't with assurance say it was this one thing, when, okay, yes, I ate more animal source food, but I also started exercising regularly. Maybe I took a multivitamin, I gave up smoking, who knows what else. Okay, so these are confounding, but at the end of the day, are you healthier or not?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're not going to kill yourself, and I can assure you that you're not going to kill the planet. And in fact, the story about eating plant source foods to save the planet is itself as poorly grounded in objective evidence as the message that said eating fat will make you fat, eating cholesterol will raise your cholesterol, saturated fat will give you heart disease. So, and in many cases, it's some of the same interests, organizations, individuals involved in, kind of bringing those messages together and then pushing them forward. So again, at some point you start to sound like, you're part of the tinfoil hat brigade, but in this case, it's there for people to see. Now, how do we get ordinary people, normal people, not like me, normal people, to just feel comfortable, eating, bacon and eggs for breakfast, maybe, tuna salad on some salad for lunch, not on a sandwich, and, maybe having a lamb chop or sausage or steak or whatever for dinner.
Mm.
Or maybe it's fish, or maybe they're omelets, or, maybe whatever that individually is. But understand that there's now a lot of evidence that you really can't live eating nothing but vegetables. You're
Mm.
not going to get the nutrition that you need. And the only way to make those diets work is to incorporate the grains and pulses. And so one researcher I spoke with said that the work that they did showed that an 8-year-old boy in India cannot eat enough physically of a rice and lentils diet to meet his needs for protein. Physically cannot do it. So, okay, it doesn't take much. Maybe an egg or two would put him over into the adequate category, but it's there. I mean, there's been studies now done where we go into communities in Africa and we make sure that the expectant mother gets 1 egg a day in addition to the normal food. And then while she's breastfeeding, 1 egg a day. That's it, 1 egg.
Mm.
And several years down the road, her child, they can measure scholastic and cognitive differences in her child relative to the children from the same community that didn't get that intervention. And whatever the problems we're facing in this world, whatever they are in 10, 20, 30 years, I'm confident that well-nourished brains communicating with each other are going to solve them. We have a really good story. A lot of the people that I work with, those industries haven't been really good at telling those stories for a number of reasons. I don't want to sound like I'm judging them. I understand some of them. But I think more and more people would like to hear that so that they would feel more comfortable when they go to the market and buy the eggs or buy the hot dogs or, buy whatever, what do you call it? Hamburger? In Ireland, they call it mince.
Well, mince is what we would buy just minced, and then we could make a hamburger from it.
Okay. So you would buy the mince from the butcher case.
Yeah.
We call it hamburger.
Oh.
Americans. So unfortunately, there's a lot of marketing and there's a lot of value add through various label claims, advertising claims. There have been industries created, to promote and promulgate this story. And I also I talk about the outrage industrial complex, that there are people whose livelihood is dependent on getting people scared, keeping them frightful, and getting them angry and in opposition. And I think they've made enough money. I think enough lives have been diminished as a result, and hopefully down the road, we can all come to understand that globally, a quarter of children under 5 years old, is it a quarter, 20%, somewhere in there, are stunted due to a lack of animal source food in their diet. Again, this is the high quality evidence that I referred to earlier. A third of women of childbearing age globally are anemic. There are nutrients that are only available from animal source foods. Doesn't have to be meat. Again, I'm being real clear. But they only come from animal source foods. And you cannot supplement the lack of those when you get into low and middle income countries. And you can look at right now there's something between 700 and 800 million people in the world today that are calorically undernourished. They simply don't get enough energy. And so this is wasting, and this is typical, classical, malnutrition. But malnutrition must be understood to also include metabolic illness. And there are something like 2.2 billion people in the world today out of what, 7.5? So 2.2 plus about 8. So we're at 3 out of 7.5. That 2.2 are overweight or obese. And we have the evidence of the rate of metabolic syndrome, metabolic illness, diabetes specifically globally. That is the unsustainable burden that's facing us. And we won't reach the sustainable development goals if we don't onboard that kind of a perspective and all that that means. And at some point, arguing, we need to stop listening to people that have failed in their duty until they demonstrate that they can be relied upon to be honest brokers in the science and policy conversations. So that's kind of my big wish, and we'll see how far we go with that. But I understand that people have to do what they can with what they have where they are. And again, if we can assure them that doing this is best for your family and it doesn't represent a threat to the future, maybe that's a good place to start.
Oh, that's so sad. I have to say, I feel very sad, listening to that. And I think we are so blessed and lucky to be able to have access to hear your information and podcasts like this. When you think of those, how many billion people that won't have access to an alternative, it's really just what they will be told and what they will be given. And I think, we have to always have hope that people like yourself and others, and it will turn. And but it has to start with, I guess, if you're sitting there and thinking, gosh, what can we do? Well, we can start with what we feed our kids and what we feed ourselves, and making sure, as we say, that it includes animal sources. And then, what makes me angry is, yes, people that have access to supplements, that push a vegan diet, and then that gets spread to people, like you say, that don't have access to supplements, and they're the ones that their children are malnourished. And it's heartbreaking. And I think that's a real, there's so many issues and problems with the the unbalanced nature of the world, but that just is heartbreaking.
Well, and we have good news. I absolutely agree. I've called it a shame. I call it a scandal. On the other hand, we have the opportunity to really affect change. Now, I don't have a clear roadmap for how to get there, but I know that there are people doing on the ground work. A person I just interviewed yesterday talked about an FAO report that said basically, two dairy cows can lift a family out of poverty in some of these parts of the world, because this represents a reliable source of income as well as high quality food for themselves. And in some parts of the world, livestock are a form of property that the cultures there allow women to own. There's a lot we can say, but that's the cultures there. And you can't go in and just change everything to the way you think it should be. We've tried that. It doesn't.
That's right.
Yeah. So all of these things. And then on top of that, people frequently confuse issues. And so they'll say, oh, look at how much land is used, as if it disappears, in livestock agriculture. And the reality is the vast majority of the Earth's surface is incapable of producing human edible food crops. Far more of what we call, so arable land, the land that you can till to produce grains and pulses and vegetables and others, is agricultural land, but not all agricultural land is arable. Right? Big difference.
Yeah.
And a lot of the rangelands, substantial portion of your continent, is not suitable for the production of human utilizable food. On the other hand, because of grasses, because of ruminant animals, we can produce food from those areas and do it in a way that at least protects and arguably enhances those environments. So we can produce this highest quality food that I argue is essential for human development and function, and do it in a way that actually benefits society in many ways beyond the food itself. So, for example, grazing management has an impact on wildland fires. And that's of interest to both your country and mine. Grazing management can foster wildlife. Grazing management can improve watershed function and health so that landscapes are more drought resistant, less flood prone, less erosion, less contamination of surface water. All of these things are realities that people have been working on literally for generations. Again, we haven't been good at telling these stories. We've got to get much better at telling them, because against us are these other stories that say, oh, no, the cows are destroying the planet, which...
The cow farts.
Well, yes, exactly. And I mean, there's lots of nuance to all these conversations. There's just a couple. Well, let me just offer this one, because if you listen to today's episode with Dr. Mitlerner from UC Davis, in the documents that they cite that estimate what agriculture's impact is, what its contribution to the man-made greenhouse gas emissions, okay, in those same documents, where they say in the US it's about 10% and globally it's about 14.5%. Those are the figures. In the same documents, they already say that they're net negative because they're bigger sinks through carbon sequestration than they are sources. Now, I wonder why they never talk about that. Can we do better? Sure, absolutely. One researcher from Brazil I got to talk to recently, somebody from his group showed that in a system where they're going to grow grass for cattle, and then later in this, maybe next year, maybe that year, they're going to go into a soybean crop. Okay, so it's the same field. What they discovered was it's more efficient use of the fertilizer to fertilize the grass, because most of the nutrients that cows consume remain in the field. Then they come behind that after they've had the cows grazing, take the cows away, plant the soybeans, no more fertilizer, same yield. So now we're producing more food from the same piece of land with similar or less input. And we're getting whatever benefits to soil health we're getting because we had a grass crop there for a while. Win, 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 win. And again, we're going to have to do that, because if we're going to meet the goals of 2050, we've got to increase food production. We've got to reduce food waste, that's for sure. But, distribution, there's lots of issues involved. But basically, we're going to have to produce more. We're not going to have any more arable land to do that with. In fact, we're losing arable land every year due to degradation and development. In North America, at least, when our cities expand, they tend to expand onto very productive land. And you can see that all over the United States. Like I described, growing up outside Philadelphia, Lower Bucks County was the breadbasket, if you will, supplying Philadelphia, since the 1700s. That's what it did. Well, now it's suburbs all the way out. Well, that land's not coming back to production. So some people have estimated, UN, FAO, others, by 2050, it's estimated we have to double food production. We're going to have an increase in demand for animal source protein by 2/3. I argue that's too low for a number of reasons, but 2/3, that's their estimate. Again, we're not going to have any more arable land to do that on. By 2050, it's estimated that 70+% of the global population will live in urbanized areas. Another one I picked up recently is it's estimated that by 2050, we're going to have to double electrical generating capacity globally. Okay, what are we doing about that? Oh, we're arguing about cow farts. Give me a break. It's not the cows. It hasn't been the cows. It won't be the cows except as part of the solution. Now, okay, maybe that doesn't help the conversation when I get that kind of an attitude. But I'm just trying to, just like you said, we've heard stories. And maybe what we should start saying is, why do I believe that? Is it because of who's telling it to me? And then you have to ask, are they worthy of that trust? Is there other information available? If anybody starts to say there's only one side to this and it's all settled, then that ought to be some flags waving very briskly, because that's just not the way this works. And again, if you read Gary Taubes's book, the first one that I read, Good Calories, Bad Calories, and I admit you have to be a geek to get through it, but that's who you're talking with right now. You understand how the process was circumvented with people, only a small number of people who got themselves properly positioned and by force of their abusive personalities got their positions accepted. And in some cases ruined the careers of people who said, no, what about this evidence over here? So it's past time for us to start asking those questions of, why do I believe this? If I say, what comes to your mind when I say healthy diet? And I used to do that with audiences until I learned the hard lesson that you're just giving control over to the audience. And it's very dangerous to do that. But, you'll hear things like moderation or variety or, whole grains or low fat or, eat the rainbow, or these sorts of things come up. And every one of those should be examined, because there's a lot there for people to understand. And there's very little evidence that backs up those stories.
Speaking of evidence, I'd love to get your thoughts on the difference. And I know this is a big conversation, but if, just a little touch on the difference between grass-based and grain-fed meat, because that's a big difference in cost. And, I certainly follow people who are very much advocates of the grass-based, and I've heard your stance on it as well. And I'd love, you to share what you see around that, because everyone, I hear all the time, animal product, it's fine for you to eat it. I can't afford it. It's too expensive. And, there's even talk of increasing taxes on meat products to get more people to eating plant products. And can you give us your just short take on that?
You expect me to
And I'm
be
going to tell,
short?
I know, and I'm going to tell people, obviously, please, in below, I'm going to have a link to Peter's podcast because he goes into a lot of this stuff. And we should be interested in this. We should be learning more about this. So please go there.
Thank you.
But just a little snippet if you can.
Sure. So, just if I could take a step back, as a forage agronomist, as somebody who worked in grazing systems, back in 2007, when I first started coming into this space, it tripped all of my confirmation biases. I mean, I was like, oh, yes, it must be grass-fed. I read what people were saying, and then I started reading the studies that they were citing to justify their claims. And then I coupled it with my understanding of metabolic illness. And so whatever the health claims are, it's got to be against the background of hyperinsulinemia. Insulin resistance is the 80% of this issue that we have to deal with first. And unless we account for that in anything we're doing, I'm not denying that these other factors could have an influence, but we have to address that first before we can know what those others are. And people on, our side of the nutrition conversation have overreached the data just like others have. So I just want to get us back to some kind of sense here. There's a couple issues. Yes, there are. We have the ability to measure minute differences in substances and make comparisons. What we lack is the ability to determine what the biological significance of those differences are. Okay. So, we see a difference, but we don't know whether it's meaningful or not. Now, people say things, but it's always informed by this idea that, too much meat causes X, or too much saturated fat causes Y, or this imbalance of these fatty acids leads to Z. And we shouldn't be as certain about that as we often seem. Okay, that's number one. Number two, the differences are relatively small. So I have a graphic that shows the difference between omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids, for example, between different animal source foods and then plant source foods. And if you're going to buy grass finished beef because of its omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, okay, fine, but don't eat pork, don't eat chicken, and don't eat walnuts. Because a handful of walnuts is orders of magnitude more omega-6 than you're going to get from your grass finished or grain finished beef. Okay, so that's number two. Number three is it's a bit of a misnomer because even in the United States, for a commercial steer throughout its life, only 10% of its lifetime feed is going to be human edible. Okay, so the rest of it's going to be hay, pasture, silage, byproduct feeds, those sorts of things. Okay. So the vast majority of an animal's life, even in the United States under our commercial systems, 3/4 of its life is going to be on pasture. And even when it goes into its finishing phase, it's still going to be getting forage as part of its ration. You can't just feed a cow, a ruminant, high concentrate ration. They're feeding it more digestible energy. They're feeding it more non-structural carbohydrates, but they have to feed it structural carbohydrates or its rumen doesn't function properly. Okay, so there's a bit of a misnomer there. People get the wrong idea of what's actually going on. Number 4 now is that those values vary tremendously based on management. So you could have grass finished, but depending on the forages that they graze, depending on the season, depending on the sex of the animal, depending on the muscle, depending on the breed, you could see variations in those contents. And sometimes they overlap. with grain finished commercial product. There's no information in the marketplace for people to make an informed purchasing decision. It doesn't exist. And we wouldn't know what to do with the information if you gave it to us. Okay, so that was 4. Number 5 is, it's my understanding that omega-3s and omega-6s are counted all as a sum, regardless of whether they come from animal source or plant source. So are omega-3s from plants equal to omega-3s from animals? And are omega-6s from animals as bad for us as the omegas? I don't think so, but that's the way they're accounted for now. And then the last one to add just into the mix is, one of the wonders of ruminant animals is you can't feed them very much fat. You can only feed them maybe 5% of their diet being ether extract, crude fat, another name. If you feed too much fat to a ruminant, it interferes with the microbial degradation of fiber and microbial fermentation. But one of the interesting things is these polyunsaturated fats are apparently more toxic to the rumen microorganisms. So the higher the amount of polyunsaturated fatty acids in the ration, or in that component, the lower the fat content in the ration must be, if I said that right. So the more polyunsaturated fat you try to feed that's available to the rumen environment, the lower the total fat in the ration has to be. Okay. So there's this thing called biohydrogenation that some of these microbes are able to do, that they actually convert those polyunsaturated fats into mono or saturated fats. So this is something, and by that process, this feed resource that some would argue we probably need to be eating less of anyway, can be converted, and the flesh of ruminant animals is always less influenced by the diet they consume than would be poultry, fish, or swine, simple stomached animals.
That's
or
fascinating.
us.
Yeah. Wow. That's
So all of that kind of put me off of, if somebody wants to buy it, wonderful. If somebody wants to have that kind of relationship with a producer, I'm all for it.
yeah.
My concern is that producers have sustainable operations based on whatever management choices they make, not the ones that are imposed from, some authority. But I don't want people to believe that in order to be good stewards of the land, it needs to be one or the other. I don't want people to believe that if they're going to improve their health, they have to do one or the other. The classic one for me is a gentleman that I've known for decades, one of the top grazers that I know, and he's part of the organic industry. And he said from the audience after one of my presentations several years ago, if you're not going to get somebody to adopt a wholly organic diet, you might as well leave them eating the standard American diet. And so we know we've transcended any objective evidence at this point. We're now completely in belief. And so I think that exists across the spectrum, which is one of the reasons I want to avoid the wars and just help people feel better about what they can afford, what's appropriate to them, what's accessible to them in their communities.
So mums, when you're at the supermarket, please just buy the meat for your family that you can afford. And I've heard you also say the same about eggs, whether it's the minute differences between pastured, free range eggs. And again, please buy what you can afford. I'm asking a question. I recently was with some friends of mine, actually Laban Ditchburn, who I know you've talked to. We were part of an Organuary campaign where we were trying to, I guess, spread the message and the nutrient information around eating more, including more organ meats in the diet. Would the same sort of differences apply to organ meats, or would they be considered a little different, being an organ instead of a muscle?
Yeah,
Because the
I
reason I
don't.
asked that,
Yeah.
because, when we were promoting it, someone said to me, "Oh, being liver or being an organ, should we choose grass-fed over, because we can get organ meat like chicken hearts and all that sort of stuff in the supermarket, which is great." Um,
Hmm.
Similar response?
Yes, very similar, exactly the
Okay,
same.
right.
At least in this country, there's surveillance protocols in the commercial food chain that these tissues are sampled routinely, and then they're tested for specific potential contaminants, and those results are published. And every year it comes back the same, that it's 99.9 some percent have no, you know, issues. Now they set limits, so you could argue, well, it needs to be 100% free. Well, you don't achieve that in any kind of testing protocol.
Yes.
But the as I said, the surveillance is in place to monitor, to make sure. And again, there are penalties if, for example, the truckload of milk arrives at the dairy, and they have rapid response tests that they test, as well as pulling samples for, maybe different kind, but they need something that can see right away. And if something turns, says, oh, there's a positive, there's a presence here, then they go back to whatever dairyman that came from, because that all gets dumped and there's a penalty. And, so all of that happens today
Mm.
and again, this is one of the things that I don't think enough people in high income countries put value on, because so many people around the world, and again, as Dr. Mitlerner said, in some parts of the world, and he was talking about China, the consumer is going, if I buy this brand or that brand or that brand of the same product, which is going to make me sick? Now, okay, that's not what we're facing. And we,
Mm.
again, have opportunities that the rest of the world would love to have.
Yeah.
So I've heard the concerns from a physiological point of view. They don't hold up from the regulatory issues. There are regulations and procedures in place to make sure that that doesn't become a problem.
Fantastic. Do you have a couple more minutes? I'm really conscious of the time. I've kept you
Absolutely.
longer. Sorry.
It's all
I
right.
could talk all day to you,
Yes.
but I
Yes.
had there's two Netflix documentaries that I've watched recently. I would just be very interested in your view on them.
Hmm.
Um, the first one actually hasn't made it to Netflix yet, but that's Diana Rogers' Sacred Cow: The Case for Better Meat. The book she's done and the movie, and I hopefully it will make it out to Netflix or public
Hmm.
viewing soon. But I've seen that one. But the other one was Kiss the Ground.
Hmm.
That was on Netflix. Have you seen those? And I'd be very interested in your thoughts on those.
Yeah. So I recommend them for people to watch. One of my lines is, if you're with a group of people you agree with 100%, you're probably in a cult. And so
I
my
love
job
it.
may be to show up and prove that wherever we are, it's not a cult, because I'm there and I can find something to disagree with.
Love
Um,
that.
I, I, I react badly to the phrase better meat. That's part of a global argument that says we need to eat less but better meat. Well, what's wrong with the meat that's available now is my question objectively. Let's
Mm.
again, in God we trust, all others must bring data. You may not be comfortable with it, but lots of people might be, especially
Yeah.
if they understood objectively what we're talking about. So that's that. Um, and the other broader kind of concern that I have is, as I said earlier, there have been people working for generations in soil conservation, in forage management, grazing management, ruminant animal systems. Globally, we've been working on these things. And I am the student of a man who was taught by a man who was taught by a man who, I mean, you understand what I'm saying. I've been around long enough to see us go through things like first it was, the organic certification, and then it was sustainable agriculture. And now we've got a push in small farming, and now we've got regenerative agriculture. And in theory, yes, support everything. Okay. The problem is the resources that need to be allocated to solve the problems that are in front of us don't get increased, they get reassigned. And so by coming up with a new thing, which isn't new, people have been doing it, you're just repackaging it. And sometimes it becomes new registered trademark. And I become the certifying authority for, right? So we create a whole business for me out of something that was in place already. Okay, that's enough. But now we take money from existing efforts and we move it to this new thing because everybody likes new, especially politicians and administrators. So those are issues that are part of my reaction. I spoke to a rancher who said, and her story is she's third generation in the cattle business. Her husband is a soils guy. They've got adult children. So, I mean, they've been at this a while, and he's been focusing on soil health before that was a thing. Interested in those topics and grazing management and farming practices. And what she said was, too many people that she interacts with think that if it doesn't have that title on it, it isn't those things.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate because, again, part of our good story is much of what people think they want is already available to them. They just don't understand that. They don't understand the label or how things are happening. So you asked me, I recommend people watch these documentaries. I've supported them. I even appeared in one of them. But I have those sorts of concerns that I've voiced before. This isn't new. And like I say, I resist the people who say, I'm an ethical omnivore or whatever. Number one, very few human beings say, well, I'm unethical, and are happy about that. I mean, so everybody thinks that they're ethical. Number two is the implied opposite is anybody who disagrees with you, therefore, is unethical. And that gets us right back to the us and them, which I don't think is helpful.
No. Peter, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I probably should let you go. I'm just hoping you could wrap it up.
Yeah. I thought you had another question.
I do have a final question,
Okay.
and that is what, I know we talked about before we started recording about the wisdom we gain as we get a little bit older. And I would love to know what wisdom you would impart on your younger self with what you know now. And I know that you probably wouldn't listen, and we'll forget about that side of it.
Yeah. No, the reality of my life and the track of my life is such that certainly the early years of my life are nothing that I want to have anything to do with ever again. That's just my reality. I understand people have different. So there's a part of this that is just, I don't even want to think about going there. The best idea that I could offer is we really do live in a remarkable age. We have opportunities that our ancestors could not have imagined, yet alone fantasized about. And we don't have to go back that far. I mean, I'm reminded that the first human being treated with penicillin was like in the late 40s. and I think he was either a postman or a policeman in London. And as I recall, he had scratched his face on a rose bush gardening, and it had gone septic. And there was nothing they could do for him. He had already lost an eye by this point. They had this drug, regulations were a little different then. They kind of, well, what could it hurt? And so they gave it to him. He got better, but they had so little of it, I've been told, that they had to actually collect and process his urine to extract whatever was excreted to give it back to him. And he was getting better. Remarkable. But they didn't have enough. And he still died of a rose scratch. And that was in the late 40s. I'm the youngest child of parents who were married twice. I don't have close relatives. My brother is my only, so I got into genealogy for a while. I've heard it said that people get into genealogy to figure out who to blame. And I found this history that somebody had compiled, and here are all these people going back in my mother's family. And you go back a couple generations, and now you start seeing like 10 kids in each family, and you're going, yes, we're going to find cousins somewhere here. And I went to the municipal cemetery in that area where they had been for 100 years or more. And I found the family plot for this one family. And I was standing there when I realized that there were all these individual unmarked markers, and then there were a couple that were a little bigger, and they were marked, and they all had the same year on them, and they added up to the number of children, saved but one or two. And something had happened to that family to just, well, how recently was that a reality for us? We don't have to face that now. I mean, yes, I know we're in a pandemic, but it's nothing like what we used to see. Ignore. Sorry, I forgot to disconnect. So we have these opportunities, and if we can, again, focus on our health, the health of our families, the health in our communities, we can make this dramatic improvement. And nobody when they're 20 worries about their health. I get it. We're bulletproof. Okay, fine. We'll wait 20 years and check with you again. Okay, just understand, maybe as you go along, as you're making decisions about, I've been talking to undergraduate classes at universities in forage agriculture and trying to encourage them about forages in North America as well as globally, and all these issues that forage agriculture could play a fundamental part in addressing. And also just trying to get people to have a broader perspective than just the one little course I'm studying right now, and start to look a little broader. So, the fact that today you can access materials online that you used to have to go to the library for. We have and then we can interact like this. I mean, this is amazing, the technology. And you could also now begin to take classes from world-renowned experts. And I've gotten quite interested in geology, and there's a professor up in Central Washington University, and he has really created this amazing niche where he gives these lectures, and he's done some things where they're out in the field and he records his presentations. Others, he's standing in front of just a general audience. And now he's actually live streaming his undergraduate lectures, Geology 101 lectures. He has over 900 people signing in to his live stream. And he's real clear. I mean, this is for the students, and I'm just letting you, kind of sit. But we have those sorts of opportunities to us today that I couldn't have imagined when I was 40. I mean, most of this is stuff that's only happened within the last, 20 years, maybe less. So, yeah, stay inquisitive might be the best advice to anyone at any time.
You know how you have that question that people ask you sometimes, like, who would you have to a dinner party? Anyone you could invite. I'd have to say, Peter, I would be you and Belinda Fecchia are top of my list. So thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to meet you in today's world and chat to you and hear your insights. And, as I said, I encourage everyone to get interested in this and to listen to the stories that you share and source people who are telling different stories to what we hear in the media and what we think, and just keep our minds open. And yeah, I agree. Like, that's probably my wisdom back to my younger self too, is keep a broader mind and an open mind. And, the minute we think we know something, we're actually closing ourselves off to learning anything new. So, and I don't want to do that.
Yeah. And if you have an experience along this way, not everybody's equipped or interested in getting public. I understand that, but there are ways to tell others, because you're not alone. And I guess that's something else is, swim with a buddy, find somebody to share this with, to help support you as you go along. And human beings always do better when we're in groups.
That's right. Yep, we do. Well, thank you very much again. It's been such an honor.
Thank you for the opportunity.